July 14, 1420, a dusty field outside Prague. A German knight named Heinrich von Eisenberg sits on his warhorse, staring at what he thinks is an easy target. In front of him, roughly 400 yards away, sits a circle of farm wagons chained together. Inside that makeshift fortress are approximately 2,000 Czech peasants, farmers, blacksmiths, brewers, weavers, armed with agricultural tools converted into weapons. Heinrich commands the vanguard of a 30,000-man crusader army sent by the Pope himself to exterminate these Hussite heretics. He's wearing 80 pounds of plate armor that cost more than a peasant family earns in 5 years. His horse is bred for war, trained to trample infantry. Around him sit 5,000 armored knights, the military elite of Catholic Europe, each representing years of training and enormous wealth. Heinrich orders the charge. He's confident. These are peasants, heretics. They'll break and run when they see real warriors bearing down on them. His horse accelerates to full gallop, lance lowered, the ground shaking under thousands of hooves. The distance closes to 200 yards. Then he hears something that doesn't belong on a battlefield. The peasants inside the wagon fortress are singing, not screaming in terror, singing, a hymn in Czech that he doesn't understand. The words are "Ye who are warriors of God." It's a battle song that will haunt Catholic Europe for 14 years. At 100 yards, the crossbow bolts start flying from the wagons, not scattered shots, volleys, coordinated fire that drops horses and punches through armor gaps. At 50 yards, the handgun fire begins, primitive firearms that belch smoke and thunder. Knights tumble from saddles, horses scream and rear. The charge hits the wagon wall and simply stops like a wave hitting stone. The chained wagons don't move, can't be overturned by cavalry impact. And now peasants are pouring out from gaps between the wagons, swinging agricultural flails, wooden sticks with chains and metal balls designed for thrashing grain, repurposed for crushing skulls inside helmets. This isn't a scene from a fantasy movie. This was the reality of the Hussite Wars, and it's one of the most revolutionary military campaigns in European history. Between 1420 and 1434, Czech peasant armies defeated 5 separate Catholic crusades, totaling over 150,000 professional soldiers. They invented mobile fortress warfare that made armored cavalry obsolete a century before gunpowder fully replaced medieval combat. They turned farm equipment into weapons of mass destruction, and they forced the Catholic Church, for the first time in history, to negotiate with heretics rather than exterminate them. This is the story of how 2,000 peasants at a time repeatedly humiliated the military might of medieval Europe. Before diving into how farmers revolutionized warfare and broke the knightly class, if you enjoy learning about forgotten military innovations, where the underdog rewrites all the rules through tactical genius and desperate necessity, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. What happened in Bohemia between 1420 and 1434 changed European warfare forever. Here's what you need to understand about the context before we get to the bloodshed. In 1415, a Czech religious reformer named Jan Hus was burned at the stake by the Catholic Church for preaching ideas that anticipated the Protestant Reformation by a century. Hus argued that the Bible should be translated into local languages, that clergy shouldn't own vast wealth, that communion should be offered in both bread and wine to laypeople, radical ideas that threatened church power structures. His execution sparked outrage in Bohemia, modern-day Czech Republic, where he was seen as a national hero standing against German and papal oppression. The movement that formed around his teachings, called Hussitism, combined religious reform with Czech nationalism and social revolution. By 1419, Hussite mobs were throwing Catholic town councillors out of windows, the first defenestration of Prague. Yes, they numbered these incidents, seizing church property and establishing independent communities that rejected papal authority. The response from Catholic Europe was predictable: extermination. Pope Martin V declared a crusade in March 1420, calling on all Christian princes to mobilize and destroy the Bohemian heretics. The Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund, who also happened to be the king of Bohemia but was rejected by the Hussites, assembled a massive army to reclaim his kingdom and eliminate the heresy. This brings us to one of the most overlooked aspects of the Hussite Wars. The Hussites shouldn't have stood a chance. They were mostly peasants and urban artisans with zero military training, facing professional armies led by experienced commanders with cavalry that had dominated European battlefields for centuries. Medieval warfare was essentially pay-to-win. The side with more armored knights almost always won because individual knights could cut through dozens of unarmored infantry. The Hussites had maybe 200 actual knights who joined their cause, plus a few thousand town militia with basic weapons. The Crusader armies brought tens of thousands of knights and professional soldiers. The Hussites survived and won because one brilliant commander, a man named Jan Žižka, invented a completely new system of warfare that neutralized cavalry advantage and turned peasant weakness into strength. Žižka was approximately 60 years old when the wars began, a one-eyed veteran of multiple European conflicts who'd served as a mercenary and minor nobleman before joining the Hussite cause. Medieval chronicles describe him as physically imposing despite his age, brutal in discipline, and possessed of tactical genius that combined engineering knowledge with psychological warfare. He understood that peasants couldn't win conventional battles, so he made sure they never fought conventional battles. The war wagon, called vozová hradba in Czech, literally wagon-fort, was Žižka's revolutionary invention. Take a standard farm wagon, reinforce it with iron plating and wooden shields, cut gun ports into the sides, and chain multiple wagons together to form a mobile fortress. Each wagon crew consisted of approximately 15 to 20 people: crossbowmen, handgunners, men with flails and pikes, drivers, and support personnel. A typical Hussite army of 2,000 fighters deployed around 100 to 150 wagons that could be chained into a defensive circle in under 15 minutes. Inside this wagon fortress, the peasants had cover, firing positions, and a defensive barrier that cavalry couldn't breach. But the genius was in the tactical system, not just the equipment. Žižka trained his armies to use the wagons as both fortress and base for counterattack. When Crusader cavalry charged, the Hussites stayed inside the wagon circle, shooting crossbow bolts and early handgun rounds that dropped horses and knights. Medieval plate armor was nearly invulnerable to sword cuts, but crossbow bolts at close range could punch through armored joints, armpits, behind the knee, visor slits. The primitive handguns, called pistoly or hand cannons, were inaccurate but terrifying, producing smoke and noise that panicked horses even when they missed. Once the cavalry charge was disrupted and stalled against the wagon wall, Žižka executed Phase 2, counterattack. The Hussite infantry poured out from gaps between wagons, targeting dismounted or disorganized knights with agricultural flails. Here's where the weapon choice becomes brilliant. A knight in full plate armor is nearly immune to sword cuts or spear thrusts. The metal deflects the blows. But a flail, a wooden handle with a chain and heavy metal ball, delivers blunt force trauma that armor can't deflect. The impact crushes the armor inward, breaking bones, pulping organs, causing concussions inside helmets. Knights who could shrug off sword strikes went down, with crushed skulls from weapons designed for beating grain. I find it incredible that we're exploring this forgotten revolution in military tactics together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with how desperate innovation can overturn centuries of military doctrine when survival demands it. Shift your perspective to that first major battle in July 1420. The Crusader army besieging Prague numbers approximately 30,000 troops under Emperor Sigismund's command. The Hussite relief force marching to break the siege is maybe 9,000 strong, including around 2,000 actual combat troops, with the rest being supply personnel and camp followers. Žižka commands the Hussite vanguard, about 1,500 fighters with 100 war wagons. The Crusaders see this small force approaching and assume it's a scouting party or a suicidal attack. They send 5,000 cavalry to crush it and demonstrate Crusader power. The cavalry charges across the open field toward Žižka's position. The Hussites form their wagon circle on a slight rise that gives them marginal elevation advantage, maybe 15 or 20 feet higher than the surrounding terrain. It doesn't sound like much, but that elevation means the cavalry has to charge uphill in the final approach, slowing them slightly. The wagons are already chained and ready, positioned with gaps just wide enough for counterattack infantry to pour through but too narrow for cavalry to exploit. As the Crusader charge reaches 150 yards, the Hussites begin their battle hymn, Kejtaj su boží bojovníci, ye who are warriors of God. It's a psychological tactic as much as religious expression. The singing demonstrates confidence, unnerves the attackers, and maintains cohesion among troops who might otherwise panic at the sight of thousands of armored knights bearing down. The crossbow volleys start at 100 yards. Hussite crossbowmen were trained to shoot at horses, not riders. A wounded or dead horse brings down an armored knight just as effectively as shooting the knight himself, and horses are bigger targets with less armor. At 50 yards, the handguns open fire. These early firearms are slow to reload, maybe one shot per minute, and wildly inaccurate beyond 30 yards. But at close range, massed handgun fire creates a wall of smoke, noise, and flying metal that's devastating against packed cavalry. Horses panic, knights tumble. The charge loses cohesion before it even reaches the wagons. The cavalry that does reach the wagon wall can't break through. The wagons are too heavy to overturn, chained together to distribute impact force, and defended by pikemen jabbing through the gaps. Medieval cavalry tactics were built around shock impact: hit the enemy line at full speed, break through, and slaughter the fleeing infantry. When the cavalry can't break through, they stall, bunch up, and become stationary targets. This is when the Hussite infantry counterattacks. Men armed with flails, war hammers, and poleaxes pour out from the wagon gaps, targeting knights who are now fighting in a chaotic melee where their armor and training provide less advantage. You're a Hussite fighter named Jacob, a 34-year-old brewer from Prague. 6 months ago you were making beer. Now you're holding a flail, a 3-foot oak handle with an iron chain attached to a spiked metal ball that weighs about 8 pounds. You've practiced with this weapon for weeks, learning to swing it in wide arcs that generate momentum and deliver devastating impact. A German knight on foot is trying to reorganize his men 5 yards from the wagon line. He's wearing full plate armor that probably cost 200 florins, more money than you'll earn in your lifetime. He's shouting orders in German that you don't understand. You step forward, swing the flail in a horizontal arc, and bring it down on his helmet. The spiked ball crashes into the metal with a sound like a blacksmith's hammer on an anvil. The helmet dents inward. The knight drops like a sack of grain, unconscious or dead. You step over him and find your next target. The battle lasts approximately 90 minutes. When it's over, roughly 1,200 Crusader knights and soldiers are dead or wounded. Hussite casualties are fewer than 100. The Crusader army besieging Prague, seeing their cavalry vanguard destroyed, retreats without lifting the siege successfully. This isn't just a military victory, it's a psychological earthquake. The knightly class, which has dominated European warfare for 400 years, has just been humiliated by farmers with modified farm equipment. The news spreads across Europe. The Pope calls for a larger crusade. The Hussites start recruiting more fighters and building more war wagons. Before diving into how this tactical system evolved over multiple crusades and why European armies couldn't counter it for 14 years, consider checking out this next video on the screen about how agricultural technology influenced medieval warfare. The connection between farming tools and military innovation is far more significant than most military historians acknowledge. The First Crusade's failure in 1420 led to the Second Crusade in 1421, a force of approximately 40,000 troops, including 8,000 heavy cavalry and significant infantry support from Germany, Hungary, and Austria. The Crusader commanders had learned from the first disaster. They wouldn't charge the wagon forts directly. They'd use siege tactics, surround the Hussites, starve them, force them to abandon the wagons and fight in the open. It was sound strategic thinking. It failed because Žižka understood logistics better than his opponents. The war wagon system wasn't just defensive. Žižka used it as a mobile base for aggressive campaigns. The Hussite armies moved constantly, raiding Crusader supply lines, burning hostile villages, and avoiding siege attempts by refusing to defend fixed positions. When Crusader armies tried to corner them, the Hussites formed their wagon fortress in minutes, fought off the attack, then disassembled and moved again before the Crusaders could bring up siege equipment. This operational mobility, the ability to fight defensively but move offensively, was unprecedented in medieval warfare, where armies typically moved slowly and required massive supply trains. The Second Crusade's decisive moment came in January 1422 at the Battle of Kutná Hora. The Crusader army, approximately 25,000 strong, cornered Žižka's force of about 3,000 Hussites in winter conditions. The Crusaders thought they had finally trapped the heretics, The Hussites were outnumbered 8-1, winter limited mobility, and supplies were running low. Žižka did something that violated all conventional military wisdom. He attacked at night. In winter, with his entire force. The Hussite night attack on the Crusader camp outside Kutná Hora is one of the most audacious operations in medieval warfare. Žižka divided his 3,000 troops into 3 columns, leaving only a skeleton crew to defend the wagon fortress. At approximately 3 a.m., the hour when human alertness is at its lowest, the Hussite columns infiltrated the Crusader camp from different directions. They didn't engage in prolonged combat. They set fires, killed sentries, caused panic, and withdrew before organized responses could form. The Crusaders, waking to flames and screaming, assumed they were under attack by a much larger force. Units retreated without orders. The camp dissolved into chaos. By dawn, the Crusader army was scattered across miles of frozen terrain, with thousands of soldiers fleeing individually or in small groups. Žižka's forces pursued and killed stragglers throughout the day. Crusader casualties exceeded 12,000. Hussite losses were fewer than 200. Let's be very clear about what Žižka accomplished at Kutná Hora. This wasn't just a military victory. It was the demonstration that peasant armies using innovative tactics could not only defend against, but actively destroy professional feudal armies through operational and tactical superiority. The psychological impact was devastating. Crusader recruitment for subsequent expeditions became increasingly difficult because knights who survived Hussite battles told terrifying stories about peasants who sang hymns while slaughtering Europe's military elite. The Third Crusade in 1427 was the largest yet, approximately 50,000 troops from Germany, Austria, and neighboring regions. By this point, Jan Žižka had died in 1424, possibly from plague, but his tactical system survived through commanders he trained. The Hussite armies now numbered around 25,000 total, with approximately 5,000 combat-ready wagon warriors at any time. The Crusaders tried a new strategy: don't engage the wagon fortresses directly. Use archery and early cannons to bombard them from distance, then starve them out. It failed for a simple reason: the Hussites had developed aggressive counterattack doctrine. When Crusader forces tried to maintain siege positions, Hussite cavalry, yes, they had cavalry too, just fewer of them, raided the besiegers. When Crusaders deployed cannon artillery, Hussite night raids destroyed the guns or killed the crews. The war wagons weren't purely defensive, they were mobile bases that enabled aggressive operations. The Third Crusade dissolved after months of inconclusive skirmishing and a devastating Hussite raid that destroyed a major Crusader supply depot near Takov. The Crusaders went home. The Hussites remained in control of Bohemia. If you made it this far, you're a true history enthusiast who appreciates how technological and tactical innovation can completely overturn established military hierarchies. Please verify your subscription now. It really helps the channel keep these forgotten stories of revolutionary warfare alive. The Fourth Crusade in 1431 represented Catholic Europe's most desperate attempt yet. The Crusader army numbered approximately 70,000 troops, the largest single force assembled for the Hussite Wars. It included contingents from Germany, Hungary, Austria, Italy, and Poland. The Pope promised full indulgences to anyone who fought. The Holy Roman Emperor committed his personal resources. Every European power that acknowledged papal authority contributed troops or money. This was supposed to be the final solution to the Bohemian heresy problem. The Crusader army marched into Bohemia in August 1431, advancing in multiple columns to avoid being caught by Hussite mobile forces. The strategy was to converge on Prague simultaneously from different directions, prevent the Hussites from concentrating their wagon forces, and crush the rebellion through overwhelming numbers. It was actually a competent strategic plan. It collapsed because of something the Crusader commanders didn't anticipate: their own troops' terror of fighting Hussites. The Battle of Damajlis in August 1431 is one of the most bizarre military engagements in European history. The Crusader army, 70,000 troops in marching formation, heard that Hussite forces were approaching. The Hussites numbered maybe 5,000 fighters, a 14-1 numerical advantage for the Crusaders. As the Hussite army came within visual range, approximately 1 mile distant, they began singing their battle hymn. The Crusader army heard the singing, and they ran. Not the vanguard, not the rear guard. the entire 70,000-man army dissolved into panicked rout without a single combat engagement. Knights abandoned their armor to flee faster. Infantry dropped weapons and ran for the border. Supply trains were abandoned. The Hussites pursued, killing stragglers and capturing equipment, but they didn't have enough troops to seriously chase a 70,000-man army. They just watched in amazement as the largest crusader force ever assembled against them fled from the sound of singing. Medieval chronicles struggle to explain Damascus because it violated all military logic. A modern psychological analysis suggests mass panic triggered by accumulated trauma. The Crusader armies included many veterans of previous crusades who'd witnessed the wagon fortress massacres. These veterans told new recruits horrifying stories about peasants with flails crushing knights, skulls, about singing heretics who didn't break under cavalry charges, about night raids and ambushes where armored men died screaming in the dark. When those same battle hymns echoed across the field at Damascus, the accumulated fear exploded into panic that spread through the entire army faster than commanders could restore order. The fifth and final crusade in 1433–1434 was a half-hearted affair, maybe 25,000 troops who knew they were going through the motions. By this point, Catholic Europe had accepted that military solutions weren't working. The Pope authorized peace negotiations with the Hussites, the first time in church history that heretics were negotiated with rather than exterminated. The Compacts of Basel in 1436 granted the Hussites significant religious autonomy, including permission to distribute communion in both kinds, bread and wine, to laypeople, one of their core demands. The Hussite wars ended not with Catholic victory, but with institutional acknowledgement that sometimes heretics win. Consider hitting that like button if you're appreciating how a peasant army, using revolutionary tactics, forced the most powerful institution in Europe to negotiate after 14 years of failed crusades and over 150,000 casualties. The military and political implications of the Hussite victories resonated for centuries. Now let's talk about the aftermath and why the Hussite wars matter beyond the immediate historical period. The war wagon tactics influenced military development for the next 200 years. When Martin Luther launched the Protestant Reformation in 1517, one reason it succeeded where Hus failed was that Protestant princes remembered what happened in Bohemia. They knew that religious reform movements could defend themselves militarily if they adopted innovative tactics and refused conventional engagement. The Hussite example inspired Protestant military doctrine during the Reformation Wars. The war wagons themselves evolved into more sophisticated forms. By the 16th century, armies across Europe were experimenting with wagon forts, mobile artillery platforms, and combined arms tactics that integrated firearms with polearm infantry. The Spanish tercio, the pike-and-shot formations that dominated European battlefields from 1500 to 1650, owed conceptual debt to Hussite innovation. The idea that defensive formations with firepower could defeat cavalry charges became central to military doctrine as gunpowder weapons proliferated. But here's the irony that history delivers. The Hussite movement eventually tore itself apart through internal conflict. By 1434, the various Hussite factions, radical Taborites, moderate Utraquists, and conservative elements, were fighting each other with the same savage efficiency they'd used against Catholic crusaders. The Battle of Lipany in 1434 saw moderate Hussites allied with Catholic forces crushing the radical Taborite faction, killing approximately 13,000 Taborite soldiers and ending the most revolutionary elements of the movement. The war wagon tactics that defeated 5 crusades were used by Hussites against Hussites in a fratricide that destroyed much of what they'd fought for. Jan Žižka, the military genius who invented the war wagon system, didn't live to see the final crusades or the internal collapse. He died in 1424, possibly from plague, at around age 64. Medieval sources say he requested his skin be made into war drums after his death, so he could continue leading Hussite armies even deceased. Whether this actually happened is disputed, but the story reveals how the Hussites viewed their commander as a quasi-mythical figure whose mere presence, even symbolically, could inspire victory. Žižka never lost a battle in his entire military career, not one. That's an almost unprecedented record in military history, especially for someone commanding peasant armies against professional forces. The Catholic Church's response to Hussite military dominance was to adjust doctrine and increase military professionalization. The repeated humiliations at the hands of Czech peasants demonstrated that religious fervor alone didn't win battles. You needed tactical innovation, training, and logistics. Later Catholic armies, especially during the Counter-Reformation, adopted combined arms tactics, professional command structures, and technological investments that made them far more effective than the Crusader armies that had been routed by singing peasants with flails. This proves one thing: military innovation occurs at the margins, not the center. The Hussites weren't military professionals with academies and traditions. They were desperate amateurs who had to innovate because conventional warfare would guarantee their extermination. That desperation produced tactical revolution. The same pattern appears throughout military history. The underdog who can't win conventionally develops unconventional methods that overturn established doctrine. The Mongols with their cavalry mobility, the English longbowmen at Crécy and Agincourt, the Hussites with their war wagons. Innovation comes from necessity. Check out this next video on the screen about how Protestant military doctrine during the Reformation Wars built on Hussite tactical innovations. The connection between religious reform and military revolution is one of the most overlooked aspects of European history. Let me give you the final accounting of the Hussite Wars. 5 major crusades launched between 1420 and 1434. Total Crusader forces deployed, conservatively estimated at 150,000 to 200,000 troops over the 14-year period. Total Crusader casualties from combat, disease, and desertion, estimated 100,000 to 150,000. Hussite military casualties, maybe 30,000 over the entire period, including internal conflicts. That's a kill ratio of roughly 5-1 in favor of the numerically inferior peasant army. The economic cost to Catholic Europe was staggering. The Crusades consumed resources that could have funded other military or political objectives, and the repeated failures damaged the prestige of both Pope and Emperor. The Hussites achieved something unprecedented: military victory by a peasant religious reform movement against the combined might of Catholic Europe, forcing institutional accommodation rather than suffering extermination. They did this through tactical innovation that neutralized cavalry advantage, operational mobility that prevented decisive engagement on enemy terms, and psychological warfare that turned their religious fervor into a weapon that broke enemy morale. But here's what gets forgotten in the celebrations of Hussite military genius. Approximately 30% of Bohemia's population died during the wars from combat, famine, and disease. The countryside was devastated by 14 years of continuous warfare. Many Hussite strongholds were depopulated. The economic infrastructure was shattered. And when the wars ended, the internal Hussite conflicts killed thousands more and destroyed the most radical reform elements. The Hussites won militarily and achieved partial religious reform, but the human cost was catastrophic. This brings us to the uncomfortable truth about revolutionary warfare. Tactical brilliance and military victory don't guarantee that the revolution achieves its goals or that the human cost is justified. The Hussites wanted religious reform, national autonomy, and social justice. They got some religious concessions and retained control of Bohemia, but the radical social reforms, redistribution of church wealth, equality of classes, were mostly abandoned in the post-war settlements. The moderate Hussites negotiated peace with Catholic authorities and marginalized the radicals who wanted to continue the revolution. By 1450, Bohemia was still Catholic majority with a Hussite minority, and the social hierarchies the revolution challenged had mostly reconsolidated. Picture the final battle of the Hussite Wars, Lipany, May 30th, 1434. Hussite moderates and Catholic allies are fighting Hussite radicals using the same war wagon tactics that destroyed 5 crusades. The Taborites, the radical faction, form their wagon fortress. The moderate Catholic alliance uses false retreat tactics to lure the Taborites out of their wagons, then surrounds them with superior numbers. It's the same tactical pattern the Hussites used against Crusaders for 14 years, now turned against fellow Hussites. Approximately 13,000 Taborite soldiers die. The revolution eats itself. The war wagons that defeated Catholic Europe can't save the Hussites from internal fratricide. I want you to remember the Hussite Wars. Remember that 2,000 peasants at a time repeatedly defeated armies of 20,000 to 70,000 professional soldiers through tactical innovation that turned defensive weakness into strength. Remember that agricultural tools, thrashing flails, farm wagons, were weaponized to destroy armored cavalry that had dominated European warfare for centuries. Remember that religious hymns became psychological weapons that broke enemy morale. Remember that the Catholic Church, which had never negotiated with heretics, was forced to accommodate Hussite demands because military extermination failed after 14 years and 5 crusades. But also remember the cost. Remember the 100,000-plus casualties across Europe. Remember the devastated Bohemian countryside. Remember the internal collapse that killed the most radical reformers. Remember that military genius and tactical revolution don't guarantee that the cause you're fighting for survives, or that the human cost is proportionate to the political outcome. The Hussite Wars prove that warfare is about innovation, not resources. The side with more knights, more money, and more institutional support lost repeatedly to peasants with modified farm equipment because the peasants invented tactics that neutralized traditional advantages. This pattern repeats throughout history. The established power assumes its superiority guarantees victory. The desperate underdog innovates out of necessity. Sometimes the underdog wins. And then history has to reckon with the fact that everything the establishment thought it knew about warfare has been overturned by farmers who refused to accept that their military inferiority was permanent. If you want to understand military innovation and how tactical revolutions occur, you must study the Hussite Wars. This wasn't gradual evolution of warfare. This was revolutionary change compressed into 14 years. War wagons went from not existing to being the dominant tactical system in Central Europe. Armored cavalry went from battlefield supremacy to obsolescence. Peasant armies went from guaranteed massacre to repeatedly defeating professional forces. And the Catholic Church went from confident crusading to reluctant negotiation, all in a single generation. Please hit subscribe and turn on notifications if you want more content that explores the forgotten military revolutions that changed how wars are fought. The algorithm needs to know that there's an audience for stories about tactical genius emerging from desperate necessity, about underdogs who rewrite the rules, about innovations that overturn centuries of established doctrine. 2,000 Hussite peasants in war wagons, 150,000 Crusader soldiers across 5 military campaigns. 14 years of continuous warfare, 5 crusades defeated, 100,000-plus casualties on the Catholic side, the Catholic Church forced to negotiate with heretics for the first time in its history, medieval cavalry rendered obsolete by farm equipment. And almost nobody today knows it happened because the story doesn't fit comfortable narratives about medieval warfare or religious conflict. The Hussites won battles through innovation. They lost the peace through internal conflict. Their tactical genius revolutionized European warfare. Their political divisions destroyed much of what they'd fought for. Both things are true, both matter. History isn't simple morality tales about good defeating evil. It's complex stories about humans under extreme pressure, making difficult choices with profound and often ironic consequences. Remember Damascus, 70,000 Crusader soldiers fleeing from the sound of 5,000 Hussites singing battle hymns. Remember that psychological warfare can be as devastating as physical combat. Remember that terror is a weapon that both sides use, and sometimes the terrorized become the terrorists. Remember the flails crushing knightly skulls inside expensive armor, agricultural tools, proving more effective than swords against the military elite. Most importantly, remember Jan Žižka, the one-eyed 60-year-old military genius who invented mobile fortress warfare and never lost a battle in his life. Remember that innovation comes from the margins, from commanders willing to abandon conventional doctrine because conventional warfare guarantees defeat. Remember that desperation breeds creativity, and sometimes the side everyone expects to lose develops tactics that rewrite military history. The war wagons of Bohemia, the singing peasant armies, the crusades that failed, the church that negotiated, the knights that became obsolete, the revolution that won militarily but fractured politically. All of it happened between 1420 and 1434 in Central Europe, while the rest of the world paid almost no attention. History forgot because the victors were peasants and heretics who don't get monuments or celebrations. But the tactical revolution they created influenced European warfare for 2 centuries and proved that military superiority is never permanent when desperate necessity meets tactical genius. That's the legacy of the Hussite Wars. That's why you should remember them. That's why this story matters. Not because the Hussites were perfect heroes, they weren't, but because they proved that established military hierarchies can be overturned, that innovation beats tradition when the innovators are fighting for survival. And that sometimes peasants with farm wagons defeat knights in plate armor by being smart enough to realize that conventional warfare is a trap and clever enough to invent something completely new. The Catholics sent 150,000 soldiers to crush 2,000 heretical peasants. The peasants kept winning. That's the story, remember it.